All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into a case that I think you're going to find pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
We're going back to the late 1990s in Atlanta, and we're going to be talking about Charles Lee Duffy.
Okay.
Now, Duffy, he was a serial killer,
Right.
but it's not just the crimes themselves, but also what his case shows us about DNA technology and how it can be used to solve cold cases even years after, the actual crimes took place.
Yeah, it's amazing how that's been developing.
Oh, absolutely. And what's cool about this deep dive is that we've got like a whole bunch of different sources. We've got Wikipedia entries, we've got some old news clippings, we even dug up some database records.
Oh, wow.
So, it's really going to give us like a really well-rounded picture of Duffy's life, his crimes, the whole thing.
Well, and that's what's interesting to me about this. We see not just the brutality of Duffy's actions, but also how dedicated the Fulton County Cold Case Unit was.
Hmm.
They used this cutting-edge DNA tech to finally bring closure to one of his victims' families years later.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we'll get into it, but that 2005 breakthrough where they were able to match Duffy's DNA to a 1997 murder, that's just incredible. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind a bit, go back to the beginning. Our sources tell us Duffy was born in 1976, and by the time he was 21, he'd already racked up, a pretty significant criminal record, robbery, auto theft, the whole 9 yards. It's almost like you see this classic pattern of escalating criminal behavior.
Yeah. It really makes you wonder, were there any missed chances to intervene earlier in his life? Could things have gone differently? It's a tough question, a question that criminologists are always trying to figure out.
Yeah.
But for Duffy, things took a seriously dark turn in the summer of '97.
Right. June of 1997, to be exact, with the disappearance of Priscilla Culberson. And this wasn't just a missing person case. This quickly turned into a homicide investigation. And the really heartbreaking part is that it was her own daughter who found her body. She was near a bus terminal.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And the details, they're pretty horrific. I mean, Culberson, she was found unclothed, and there's evidence suggesting that there was a struggle, like she fought back against her attacker.
Oh.
But the good news, I guess, in this terrible situation is that investigators were able to collect DNA evidence at the scene,
Oh.
both semen and blood. And they didn't know it at the time, but these samples would eventually become, the key to finally bringing Duffy to justice for this crime. But that wouldn't happen for, almost a decade.
It's amazing to think about that, how that evidence can sit there for so long.
It is, yeah, it really is. It's chilling to think about Culberson's daughter finding her mother like that. But unfortunately, Duffy's crimes didn't end there.
Right.
Only a month later, in July of '97, Gwendolyn Wish, she was shot multiple times right outside of her own home. And sadly, she didn't survive.
Oh, gosh.
And to add to the tragedy, her father was a minister. So you can imagine the shock, the grief
Of course.
that this family must have gone through.
Just awful.
This attack, it seemed so random, so brutal.
Right.
It really put all of Atlanta on edge. At first, investigators, they thought maybe it was just a robbery gone wrong.
Yeah, that would make sense.
But the more they dug into it, they realized that theory didn't really hold up.
Right.
And then just a few days after Witch's murder, Duffy strikes again.
Oh, no.
This time he robs a convenience store and he shoots the owner, Yeo Kim. And these crimes, they were just so brutal, so seemingly random.
Right.
I mean, they had the whole city living in fear.
I bet.
Now, what's really important about the Kim murder is that there was surveillance footage.
Oh, okay.
And this footage, it was a game changer. It gave investigators their first real look at the man who was terrorizing their city.
So they finally had a face to put to these crimes.
Exactly, yeah.
Huh.
And that's when things took a really dramatic turn in the case. Duffy's own mother, she sees that footage, they're broadcasting it everywhere, and she recognizes her son.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine to know that your own child is capable of these horrific acts?
I can't even imagine.
It must have been such a weighty decision for Duffy's mother to
Yes.
turn in her own son.
But she probably saved lives by doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
By turning him in, she potentially saved countless lives, and she made sure that justice, at least for Wesh and Kim, could be served.
Yeah, that's huge.
So Duffy's face is all over the news. The entire city is on edge. And then just a few days later, they catch him. But there's a twist. The police, they arrest him under the name Taurus Smith. and he was high on drugs, carrying a screwdriver.
A screwdriver, what do you make of that?
I know, right? It's a strange detail. Some people might see it as a sign that he was still intent on hurting people,
Yeah, that he was still dangerous.
while others might say, it was just a tool he had on him for whatever reason.
Right, just a random thing.
It's hard to say for sure, but it's these little details, that really highlight how complex criminal behavior can be.
It's not always black and white.
No, it's not. But regardless, they had Duffy, confirmed to be the man in the surveillance tapes, in custody. So what happens next? Well, facing a mountain of evidence against him, Duffy decides to confess. He confesses to the murders of Woosh and Kim.
Okay.
He takes a plea deal that takes the death penalty off the table,
Right.
and he receives 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole,
Wow.
meaning he'll never be a free man again.
So for the families of Woosh and Kim, at least there's some sense of closure, some justice served. But what about Priscilla Culberson?
That's right. Her case at this point is still unsolved.
So what happens next?
Well, this is where that DNA evidence we talked about earlier, the samples collected back in '97, become crucial. They become a glimmer of hope in a case that seemed to have gone cold.
That's really interesting. So we're going to see how that DNA evidence plays a role down the line.
Oh, absolutely. But we're going to have to wait just a little bit longer to see exactly how that unfolds.
All right, I'm on the edge of my seat.
Okay, so it's 2005 now. 8 years have passed since Culberson's murder. What exactly changed in the world of DNA technology during those years that allowed investigators to finally make that match to Duffy?
Well, you got to remember that back in '97, DNA analysis was really still in its early stages,
Right, it was pretty new.
Yeah, the techniques they had then, they were slow, expensive, and they needed a lot more, a much bigger sample to even work.
Hmm.
But by 2005, things were totally different. Remember, the Human Genome Project had just wrapped up a few years before that.
Right.
That project just blew the doors wide open when it came to understanding DNA, and that led to a ton of new tech for analyzing it.
So it wasn't just that they already had Duffy's DNA on file because of his earlier convictions. The technology itself had come a long way, so they could analyze these tiny, even degraded samples way more accurately and quickly than before.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. By 2005, law enforcement started using this new tool called familial DNA searching. It's like imagine casting a wider net. They weren't just looking for an exact match to the suspect's DNA anymore.
Right.
They were looking for partial matches too. Matches that might point them to a relative of the suspect.
Wait, so you're saying they could find a relative of an unknown suspect just by searching these DNA databases?
Yeah, that's the idea. It's based on, how family members share a lot of their DNA. So even if the suspect's DNA isn't in the database, they might find a close relative, which could give investigators a huge lead.
That's amazing. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but you're looking for other needles that are, bent the same way. But doesn't that bring up some serious ethical questions too? I mean, what about the privacy of those relatives?
It's a powerful tool for sure. I mean, it has the potential to solve so many cold cases and give families closure, but you're right, there are definitely ethical things to think about. It's a tricky issue, no easy answers. And as this technology gets even more advanced, we're going to have to keep asking these tough questions about privacy, consent, and making sure it's not misused.
It's like a double-edged sword, right? You've got this amazing tool that can bring justice, but it also makes you wonder how far is too far in that pursuit.
Yeah, exactly. It's a discussion that needs to keep happening as DNA technology keeps advancing.
For sure. So we've talked about how DNA technology evolved and played a role in Duffy's case, but what about Duffy himself? What's happened to him since those life sentences?
Well, as of today, January 28th, 2025, Charles Lee Duffy is still in prison. He's at Georgia State Prison, serving multiple life sentences without parole.
Right.
His story, it's tragic and disturbing, but it really shows just how complex the criminal justice system is and how forensic science keeps changing the game.
Yeah, it really makes you think. It's kind of hard to believe this whole case spans decades, from those first crimes in the late 90s to his arrest and then this cold case breakthrough years later. It shows you how persistent those investigators were, never giving up on finding justice.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about Duffy's mom. Her choice to turn him in, that must have been incredibly difficult, but it was the right thing to do. She stopped him from hurting anyone else. It's a good reminder that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that matter most.
It's true. It's easy to forget sometimes that behind all the files and headlines, there are real people whose lives were changed forever by these crimes.
You're absolutely right. We can get lost in the details, the legal stuff, but it's important to remember the human cost of these crimes and the lasting impact they have on the victims and their families.
When you say complexities, what comes to mind? What makes the criminal justice system so intricate?
Well, think about it. The system has to juggle so many things at once. Keeping the public safe, protecting people's rights, making sure victims get justice, and trying to rehabilitate offenders.
Right.
Finding that balance, it's incredibly tough, especially as technology changes things and societal values shift.
You've already talked about how DNA tech has revolutionized how we investigate and prosecute crimes. Are there other areas where technology is changing things in the criminal justice system?
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing artificial intelligence and machine learning being used everywhere now. It's used in risk assessment, predictive policing, all sorts of things.
Wow.
These technologies, they can make the system more efficient, more effective, but, there are risks and ethical concerns that come with them.
So it's like we're always walking this tightrope between using these new innovations and making sure we're not creating bias or unintended consequences.
You got it. And that's where the human element comes in.
Yeah.
Technology is a powerful tool, but it's people making the decisions, shaping the system.
Right.
We got to make sure those decision makers are informed, ethical, and using these tools responsibly.
It sounds like there needs to be more awareness, more education, more conversations about the ethics of all these advancements. We can't just blindly adopt new technologies without thinking about how they might affect individuals and society as a whole.
I totally agree. That's one of the things that makes this field so fascinating to me. It's always changing. What's cutting edge today might be old news tomorrow. And as technology keeps moving forward, we've got to be ready to adapt, ask tough questions, and make sure justice is always the priority.
It's almost like a race, trying to stay ahead of the curve and understand what these advancements could mean before they become commonplace.
It's kind of like that, yeah. But I also see it as a chance to shape the future of criminal justice in a way that lines up with our values and how we want a just and equitable society to look.
Duffy's case, with all its twists and turns and how it was finally solved with DNA technology, it shows us how important it is to never stop fighting for justice.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that even the coldest cases can still be cracked.
Yeah, and that gives hope to victims and families who are still looking for answers, for closure. The advances in forensic science, they're creating new ways to investigate these cold cases. There's this whole movement now to look at old evidence with fresh eyes, use modern techniques, and maybe finally bring closure to these unsolved crimes.
That's great to hear. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Charles Lee Duffy's case, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners take away from this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the world of criminal justice, it's complicated and it's always changing.
Yeah.
Technology is playing a bigger role than ever before, and that opens up so many possibilities. But it also means we have to think carefully about the ethical side of things.
For sure.
Duffy's story is a reminder of how much crime affects people, the power of forensic science, and how important it is to keep talking about how we balance innovation with protecting individual rights and making sure everyone has access to justice.
I think you put that perfectly. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive into a really chilling case, one that still has an impact all these years later. I hope this has sparked some curiosity in our listeners. Maybe you'll be inspired to look into other cold cases or learn more about the latest developments in DNA technology or even start conversations about the ethics of all this.
I hope so.
Whatever you do, stay informed, keep asking questions, and be a part of shaping the future of this really important field. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Well, think about it. It has to juggle, keeping the public safe, but also protecting everyone's rights.
Right.
It has to make sure victims get justice, but also try to rehabilitate the people who commit the crimes.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And it's really hard to find that balance, especially with technology changing things so fast and, society's values evolving.
You've talked about how DNA technology has changed how we investigate and prosecute crimes. Are there other areas where technology is having a big impact on the criminal justice system?
Oh, tons. I mean, think about artificial intelligence, machine learning. We're seeing those used everywhere now, from risk assessment tools to predictive policing algorithms.
Wow.
These technologies could make the system much more efficient, much more effective, but they also come with these inherent risks, these ethical questions we have to grapple with.
Yeah. It's like we're always trying to walk this line, right? Embrace the innovation, but also guard against potential bias or those unintended consequences you mentioned.
Exactly. And that's where the human element is so important. Technology is a tool, right? But ultimately, it's people making the decisions, shaping the system. We need to make sure those people are informed, they're ethical, and they're using these tools responsibly.
So it sounds like what we need is more awareness, more education, and just more conversations about the ethical implications of all this new technology. We can't just jump in head first without thinking about the potential consequences for individuals and for society as a whole.
I couldn't agree more. And that's what I find so fascinating about this field. It's always evolving. Something that's groundbreaking today could be outdated tomorrow. And as technology keeps developing, we need to be ready to adapt, to ask the tough questions, and always, always make sure justice is the priority.
It's like we're in this race, trying to stay ahead of the curve, understand the potential consequences of all these advancements before they become widespread.
It's kind of like that, yeah. But I also see it as an opportunity. We have a chance to shape the future of criminal justice, make sure it aligns with our values and creates a more just and equitable society.
Duffy's case, with all its twists and turns and how it was finally solved because of DNA technology, it shows us that we should never give up on the pursuit of justice. It's a reminder that even the coldest cases can be cracked.
And that's a powerful message of hope for victims and families who are still waiting for answers, still waiting for closure. Advances in forensic science are giving us new ways to investigate cold cases, and there's this whole movement now to re-examine old evidence, apply modern techniques, and potentially bring resolution to these unsolved crimes.
That's really encouraging. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Charles Lee Duffy's case, what's the main takeaway you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that criminal justice is a complex system, and it's constantly changing. Technology is a huge part of that, and that brings incredible opportunities, but we need to be careful about the ethical implications too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Duffy's story is a reminder of how much crime impacts people, the power of forensic science, and how important it is to keep talking about finding that balance between innovation, protecting people's rights, and making sure justice is served.
You put it perfectly. This has been a fascinating deep dive, a thought-provoking look into a truly chilling case, and it's incredible how it still resonates all these years later. I hope this has inspired our listeners to learn more about the world of criminal justice and how forensic science is changing everything. Maybe you'll want to research other cold cases or find out more about the latest developments in DNA technology, or even just start a conversation about the ethics of it all.
I love that.
Whatever you choose to do, stay curious, keep asking questions, and be a part of shaping the future of this incredibly important field. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.